The night her husband looked her straight in the eyes and said, "You're not my wife anymore," he thought he had already won. He packed a suitcase, smiled like a conqueror, and walked out the front door with another woman waiting in the car outside. 3 days later, he drove out to the lake house they had shared for almost 20 years, expecting the gate to swing open the way it always had. Instead, the security gate stayed shut, cold and silent under the afternoon sun. Naomi Carter watched from the balcony as he pounded on the door, his knuckles turning red against the wood. Then she reached for the intercom, her voice calm and even, and said 5 words that would change everything. "You're the one who left." For almost 20 years, Naomi Carter had built her life around the quiet architecture of another person's ambition. She was 42 years old, an architect by training and a real estate investor by instinct, though almost no one outside her closest circle knew the second part. She dressed simply, drove an unremarkable sedan, and preferred a quiet afternoon with blueprints spread across her kitchen table to any kind of spotlight. People who met her at dinner parties often assumed she was someone's assistant or a stay-at-home wife, with nothing more pressing than errands and lunch dates. She never corrected them. It had never seemed worth the trouble, and besides, there was a kind of peace in being underestimated. She had married Richard Hayes when he was 26 years old, and hungry for a life bigger than the one his parents had given him. He was sharp, articulate, and relentless, the kind of man who could walk into a room and make everyone believe he already belonged at the head of the table. Naomi had believed in him before anyone else did, and for years she had quietly rearranged her own ambitions to make space for his. She turned down 2 major design commissions early in their marriage so she could help him study for the bar, host the dinners that built his reputation, and manage the household so his mind stayed free for casework. She never once framed it as sacrifice. She simply called it partnership. And for a long time, that was exactly what it was. Richard's career rose the way a fire rises when it is fed exactly what it needs. He became a partner at his firm in his late 30s, and by his mid-40s he was one of the most sought-after litigators in the city, a man whose name alone could settle a negotiation before it started. But somewhere along that climb, something in him had shifted. He came home later and later, sometimes not until midnight, always with a reasonable explanation, and never with an apology. He stopped asking Naomi about her day, and when he did speak to her, there was a new edge in his voice, something close to condescension, as though he were addressing an employee rather than a wife. His colleagues, who had never bothered to learn much about her, began referring to her privately as the woman who lived off Richard's success, and Richard never once corrected them either. In the early years of their marriage, Naomi had genuinely believed the life they were building was a shared one, 2 people pulling in the same direction toward the same horizon. She remembered small kindnesses from that time, the way Richard used to leave notes on the kitchen counter before early court appearances, the way he called her from the courthouse steps, just to hear her voice before walking into a hearing that would decide someone else's future. Those memories had not disappeared entirely, even after everything that followed, and Naomi sometimes found herself wondering when exactly the shift had begun, whether it had come gradually, the way water wears down stone, or whether some single, unremarkable evening had quietly set the whole decline in motion, without either of them noticing at the time. By his early 40s, Richard had begun keeping company with a different kind of person than the ones he had known as a younger, hungrier attorney. Partners at larger firms invited him to dinners where the conversation revolved around vacation homes and private clubs, and Richard, eager to belong among them, began speaking of his own life in ways that quietly erased Naomi's presence from it. He would describe the lake house as something he had built for his family, never once mentioning that his wife had purchased it outright before they had even met. He would talk about the freedom his income provided, never acknowledging that freedom had existed in their household long before his salary reached the level he now took such pride in. Naomi heard these conversations secondhand, through mutual acquaintances who repeated them without any particular malice, simply passing along what Richard himself had said, and each time she absorbed the erasure quietly, filing it away with the rest. What none of them knew, not Richard, not his colleagues, not even the newer friends who had entered his orbit as his star rose, was that Naomi had inherited a modest fortune from her parents in her 20s, long before she ever met Richard Hayes. She had invested it carefully and patiently, buying land along the lakefront years before that stretch of shoreline became fashionable, long before developers and executives began fighting over every remaining parcel. The lake house Richard now considered the crown jewel of their marriage, the place where they had spent 20 summers, countless anniversaries, and every holiday that mattered, had been purchased entirely in cash, under Naomi's name alone, 3 years before she and Richard had even met. She had never hidden this from any sense of shame or deception. She had simply never needed to announce it, and Richard had never once thought to ask. He assumed, the way successful men sometimes assume without ever examining the assumption, that everything good in their shared life had originated with him. One evening, during an argument about nothing particularly important, he had said something that Naomi would replay in her mind for months afterward, a sentence delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who believed it to be simple fact. "Without me," he told her, "you're nothing." She had not answered him that night. She had simply looked at him for a long moment, filed the sentence away somewhere quiet and permanent, and gone to bed. The night everything finally broke came on an ordinary Thursday, the kind of evening that gave no warning of what it was about to become. Richard arrived home well past 10 o'clock, his tie loosened, his phone buzzing against the kitchen counter, with a name Naomi had come to recognize far too well. Vanessa Cole was a colleague at his firm, 38 years old, ambitious and unbothered by the fact that Richard was married, and her messages had grown more frequent over the past several months, arriving at hours that had nothing to do with casework. Naomi had noticed the pattern long before that night, the way Richard angled his phone away from her, the way his voice softened when he stepped into another room to take certain calls. But she had waited, watching, gathering her own quiet understanding of what was happening. That night, she finally asked him directly, her voice steady and without accusation, simply a question laid plainly on the table between them. Richard's patience, already worn thin from months of quiet guilt curdling into resentment, snapped all at once. He told her she had never understood what it meant to build something, that she had spent 2 decades coasting on the comfort he provided while contributing nothing of real consequence. Naomi reminded him, gently, of the years she had spent supporting his career, the sacrifices she had never once mentioned aloud until that moment. Richard's response came fast and sharp, as though he had been waiting for an excuse to say it. "You're not my wife anymore," he told her, and the words landed in the kitchen like something breaking. It was not a legal declaration. No court had granted it, no document had been signed, no lawyer had drafted a single clause. It was simply Richard, standing in the kitchen of the home Naomi had built her entire adult life around, declaring their marriage over by the sheer force of his own will, as though 20 years could be dissolved with a single sentence spoken in anger. He turned and walked upstairs, and within the hour he had packed 2 suitcases, with the efficient calm of a man who had clearly been preparing for this moment far longer than Naomi had realized. He did not look at her again as he carried his bags to the front door. There was something almost theatrical in how quickly he moved, and Naomi noticed it even through the shock of the moment, the way his suitcases seemed already half-organized, the way he did not search for anything, did not hesitate over drawers or closets the way a man does when he is truly deciding something for the first time. She understood, watching him from the top of the stairs, that this had not been a decision made in that kitchen at all. It had been arriving for weeks, perhaps months, and the argument over dinner had simply given him the excuse he needed to finally say aloud what he had already resolved to do in private. That realization did not soften the pain of the moment, but it did something else, something quieter and more useful. It began to clarify her own thinking, stripping away any lingering hope that this was simply anger speaking, and replacing it with the steady understanding that whatever came next would require her full attention and none of her forgiveness. Outside, in the driveway, a car was already waiting, its headlights cutting through the dark. Vanessa Cole sat behind the wheel, and when Richard opened the passenger door, Naomi watched from the window as the two of them exchanged a brief, easy smile, the kind of smile shared between people who believed themselves to be beginning something new and unburdened. Naomi did not cry. She stood at the window until the taillights disappeared down the street, and then she went to bed, her mind already moving past the pain and into something colder and more deliberate. By morning, she had made a single phone call, one she had known for years she might eventually need to make. Helen Brooks answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the particular steadiness of a woman who had spent 40 years practicing law and had long since stopped being surprised by what people were capable of. She had been a close friend of Naomi's late mother, and in the years since, she had become something between a mentor and a guardian, the one person outside Naomi's immediate family who understood the full architecture of her finances. "Are you ready?" Helen asked simply, without needing further explanation of what had happened. Naomi looked out at the gray morning light, settling over her kitchen, and answered without hesitation. "It's time," she said, and something in her voice told Helen that 20 years of careful patience had finally reached its end. What almost no one in Richard's life understood, and what Richard himself had never bothered to learn, was the full scope of what Naomi actually owned. The lake house, purchased outright in cash before their marriage, was only the most visible piece of a portfolio she had spent 2 decades quietly building. There was a small but profitable real estate investment company registered entirely in her name, a trust established by her parents that had grown steadily under careful management, and a stock portfolio she had assembled with the same patience she brought to every blueprint she had ever drawn. Richard had never once asked to see any of it, secure in his belief that his salary was the true engine of their household, never imagining that his wife's quiet, understated life concealed a fortune several times the size of his own. That morning, Naomi did not waste a single hour. She called a locksmith and had every entry code at the lake house changed before noon. She contacted the property management office and formally updated the ownership documentation. A formality, really, since her name had been the only one on the deed from the very beginning, but a necessary one all the same. She placed a call to Marcus Reed, the property manager who had overseen the lake house grounds for nearly 15 years and who had always regarded Naomi, quietly and correctly, as the true authority over the estate, regardless of whose name Richard liked to use when introducing himself to guests. Marcus was 50 years old, a steady, soft-spoken man who had managed the property since Naomi first purchased it, long before Richard had ever set foot on the grounds. He remembered, even if Richard never had, that every maintenance invoice, every renovation decision, every payment for the dock repairs, and the new roof had always come through Naomi's approval alone. He had watched Richard grow more comfortable over the years, treating the estate as though it were an extension of his own success, and he had said nothing because it was not his place to correct a guest, however frequent that guest happened to be. But he had never once forgotten whose signature actually mattered. Her instructions to him were short and absolute. "No one enters without my approval," she said, "not even Richard." Marcus did not ask a single question. He simply said yes and meant it completely. 3 days later, Richard called the lake house directly, his voice light and untroubled, informing whoever answered that he intended to come out for the weekend to collect a few personal belongings he had left behind. He had no idea, of course, that the world he was about to drive into had already rearranged itself entirely without him. He assumed the house would open for him exactly as it always had, because in his mind, nothing fundamental had truly changed. He was still Richard Hayes, still the man whose name opened doors, still, in his own estimation, the architect of every good thing in his life. He packed an overnight bag with the same casual confidence he had carried out of the kitchen 3 nights earlier, certain that whatever storm he had caused would have already begun to settle in his favor. He arrived at the lake house on Saturday afternoon behind the wheel of his Mercedes, Vanessa seated beside him in the passenger seat, both of them laughing about something as the car wound along the familiar lakeside road. The property came into view exactly as it always had. The long stone driveway, the tall hedges Naomi had planted a decade earlier, the iron gate that had opened for Richard 1,000 times before, without a single moment's hesitation. He pulled up to the security panel and punched in the entry code from memory, the same 6 digits he had used for years, confident and unbothered. The gate did not move. Richard tried the code again, certain he had simply misdialed it, his fingers pressing more deliberately the second time. Still nothing. A small, irritated laugh escaped him. The kind of laugh a man gives when he assumes a minor technical glitch is the only obstacle standing between him and what he already believes belongs to him. He reached for his phone and dialed Marcus Reed directly, his tone still light, still carrying the easy authority he had always used when speaking to staff. Marcus answered on the second ring, his voice polite but entirely unmoved by Richard's familiar tone. "I work for Miss Carter," Marcus told him simply, and nothing more. Richard laughed again, waving a hand as though brushing away a fly. Certain this was nothing more than a misunderstanding that would resolve itself the moment someone with real authority looked into it. He asked Marcus to simply open the gate, framing it as a small favor between men who had known each other for years. But Marcus's answer did not change. He explained, calmly and without a trace of apology, that his instructions came directly and exclusively from Naomi Carter, and that those instructions were absolute. Richard's confidence began to falter for the first time, a small crack forming in the certainty he had carried with him all afternoon. He stepped out of the car and approached the gate on foot, peering through the iron bars at the house beyond, the house where he had spent 20 summers believing, without ever once verifying, that half of it belonged to him simply because he had lived inside it. Vanessa remained in the car, watching through the windshield as Richard's composure began to unravel in real time. He pressed the intercom button repeatedly, his voice rising with each attempt, demanding that someone open the gate immediately. He called Marcus again, and then a third time, his tone shifting from irritation to something closer to fury, the particular fury of a man discovering that the ground he had always assumed was solid beneath him had never truly belonged to him at all. He pounded his fist against the iron bars, the sound echoing across the quiet lakefront property, and shouted toward the house that someone had better come explain what exactly was going on. It was then that Naomi appeared on the balcony above the entrance, standing perfectly still in the late afternoon light, watching him with an expression that carried no anger and no satisfaction, only a kind of quiet, settled calm. Richard looked up and saw her, and for a moment his shouting stopped entirely, as though her presence alone had reminded him of something he had not fully considered before making this trip. "Open my house," he called up to her, his voice still carrying traces of the authority he had always assumed he possessed. Naomi did not raise her voice to match his. She simply looked down at him and repeated 2 words back, quiet and precise. "Your house?" She stepped toward the small panel mounted near the balcony railing and pressed a single button. A screen embedded near the gate flickered to life, displaying a document Richard recognized instantly, even from a distance. The property deed for the lake house, scanned and enlarged for anyone standing at the entrance to read clearly. At the top of the page, beneath the legal description of the land and the structures built upon it, a single name appeared as the sole owner of record, Naomi Carter. Richard stared at the screen for a long moment, his mouth slightly open, the fury draining out of his face and leaving something closer to disbelief in its place. He turned back toward the intercom, his voice quieter now, almost pleading, insisting that there had to be some mistake, that he had contributed to this property for 20 years, that his name belonged on that document as much as hers did. Naomi let him finish before she answered, her tone never once rising above the same steady calm she had carried since the moment she stepped onto the balcony. "You walked away," she told him simply, 3 days ago, in our kitchen. "You told me I wasn't your wife anymore. I'm simply agreeing with you." Behind him, Vanessa had stepped out of the car, her earlier ease entirely replaced by a look of growing unease, watching a man she had believed to be one of the most powerful people she knew, standing helpless outside a locked gate. Later that evening, once Richard and Vanessa had finally driven away, Naomi sat alone on the balcony and allowed herself, for the first time in days, to think back over the full arc of the life she had built. She had grown up watching her parents manage money quietly and carefully, never flashing wealth, never explaining themselves to anyone who doubted them. When they passed, within 2 years of each other, they had left her not just a modest inheritance, but a set of instincts about patience and timing that she had carried into every investment she made afterward. She had bought the land along the lake more than 2 decades earlier, back when it was considered too remote and too undeveloped to interest anyone with real money, back before the shoreline became the sought-after address it was today. She had built the investment company slowly, reinvesting nearly everything for the first 10 years, taking no salary from it at all, letting it grow in the background of a life that, to anyone looking in from the outside, appeared to revolve entirely around her husband's ambitions. Richard had always believed, without ever really examining the belief that his income was the true foundation of their household, that the comfortable life they shared existed because of his billable hours and his partnership shares. He had never once asked how the lake house had been purchased outright with no mortgage. Never once questioned why Naomi seemed entirely unbothered by market downturns that sent his own colleagues into a panic. She had let him believe what was easiest for him to believe, because the alternative had never seemed worth the argument. The truth, which Naomi had known for years, and which Richard was only now beginning to understand, was that she was worth several times what he was, and had been for a very long time. She had simply chosen to live simply, to drive a modest car and wear unremarkable clothes, because the quiet life had always suited her better than the version Richard performed for his colleagues and clients. There was no vanity in her wealth, no desire to display it, only a steady confidence that came from knowing exactly what she had built and exactly who had built it. That confidence, more than any document or any locked gate, was the thing Richard had never truly seen in her, not once in 20 years of marriage. She thought, too, about the early years of her career as an architect, back when she had still believed she might build a name for herself the way Richard had built his, through visible, public achievement rather than quiet, private accumulation. She remembered the 2 commissions she had turned down in her early 30s, both of them significant enough that accepting either one might have changed the entire trajectory of her professional life. At the time, she had told herself the decision was simple, that Richard's career needed her support more urgently than her own needed the exposure, and she had never once regretted the choice while she was living inside it. Only now, sitting alone on the balcony, with the weight of everything that had happened settling around her, did she allow herself to wonder what that other version of her life might have looked like, the one where she had chosen her own ambition over someone else's, and whether that woman would have recognized the quiet, patient life she had built instead. She did not linger long in that wondering, because regret had never been a place she liked to stay. What mattered now was not the paths she had not taken, but the ones still open in front of her, wide and entirely her own for the first time in 2 decades. She had spent years building a foundation so solid that no single sentence, however cruel, could ever truly shake it. And now, finally, she understood exactly why she had built it that way, even if she had never consciously admitted the reason to herself until this very moment. Helen Brooks had known Naomi since she was a teenager, back when Naomi's mother would bring her along to quiet afternoon meetings that Naomi, at the time, found impossibly boring. It was Helen who had first taught her the difference between wealth that announced itself and wealth that simply endured, a distinction that had shaped nearly every financial decision Naomi made in the decades that followed. When Naomi's parents passed, it was Helen who had helped her structure the inheritance in a way that would protect it from exactly the kind of situation she now found herself living through, though at the time, neither of them could have known how precisely that foresight would eventually matter. Over the years, their relationship had grown into something closer than attorney and client, something closer to family, and it was that bond, more than any formal arrangement, that made Naomi's first call after Richard walked out feel less like seeking legal counsel and more like reaching for someone who had always understood exactly who she was. Within a week, Helen Brooks called Naomi with news that, while unsurprising, still carried its own particular weight. Richard had retained a divorce attorney and was preparing to file, and according to sources within the legal community that Helen still maintained close ties to, he intended to pursue an aggressive claim to half of everything, the lake house included, on the grounds that it had functioned as marital property throughout their entire relationship. Richard genuinely believed, with the same confidence that had carried him through 2 decades of courtroom victories, that the law would simply hand him half of a life he had spent very little time actually building. His attorney, A capable but overconfident man named Gregory Simmons assured him the case would be straightforward. The confidence did not survive contact with the documents. When Richard's legal team requested the full financial history of the marriage, Helen, representing Naomi, provided everything requested, precisely and completely, because there was nothing to hide and nothing to fear from full transparency. The deed to the lake house dated 3 years before Richard and Naomi had even met. The formation documents for the investment company filed a full 5 years before their wedding. The trust established by Naomi's parents, structured in a way that placed it entirely outside the reach of marital claims, regardless of when the marriage occurred. Page after page, the story told itself, and it was not the story Richard had assumed he was living inside. Gregory Simmons went quiet somewhere around the 4th document, and by the time he reached the stock portfolio statements, his expression had shifted entirely. The easy confidence of their first meeting replaced by the careful, measured tone of a lawyer, beginning to understand that his client had badly misjudged the strength of his own position. Richard sat across from him, watching the color drain slowly from his own certainty, the realization settling over him in stages that everything he had believed about his marriage, about his contributions, about the balance of power between himself and his wife, had been built on an assumption he had simply never bothered to verify. Richard spent that night replaying every conversation he had ever had about their finances, searching for some moment where Naomi might have deceived him outright, some lie he could point to and use to justify the anger still burning beneath his growing panic. He could not find one. She had never claimed the lake house belonged to him. She had never told him the investment company was theirs jointly. He had simply assumed, the way he assumed most things about his own life, that success gathered naturally around a man like him, and he had never once thought to verify whether the assumption was true. Lying awake that night, in the guest room of Vanessa's apartment, a space that already felt smaller and less certain than it had a week earlier, Richard began to understand, slowly and painfully, that the confidence he had always mistaken for competence had left him blind to the one relationship that had actually mattered most. Vanessa's reaction, when the details eventually reached her, was its own kind of quiet unraveling. She had aligned herself with Richard, in part because she believed him to be a man of significant means, a rising partner whose lifestyle promised stability and comfort, and the discovery that the marriage he was leaving had been financially anchored almost entirely by the woman he was abandoning, left her recalculating everything she thought she understood about the situation she had stepped into. Their conversations grew shorter. Her messages, once constant, began arriving less frequently, and then almost not at all. Within days of receiving the full financial disclosure, Richard's own attorney recommended, in careful and diplomatic language, that his client consider settlement rather than continuing toward a trial he was very unlikely to win. Richard sat with that recommendation for 2 days before he finally called Naomi directly, his voice carrying none of the sharp confidence that had once defined every conversation between them. He asked to meet, not through their attorneys, but in person, just the two of them, somewhere quiet. Naomi agreed, choosing a small cafe near the office she rarely visited, a neutral space that belonged to neither of their old shared life nor to whatever new life Richard was now scrambling to construct. When he arrived, he looked visibly diminished. The posture that had once commanded courtrooms now smaller, more uncertain, a man clearly aware that the ground beneath him had shifted in ways he was still struggling to fully accept. He apologized, and to his credit, the apology sounded genuine, stripped of the performance he had once brought to every important conversation. He told her he had been wrong, that he had let success distort his sense of what he owed the person who had helped him build it, that he had said things in anger he now understood to be both cruel and false. Naomi listened without interrupting, her expression steady, giving him the full space to say everything he had come to say. When he finished, she asked him a single question, quiet and direct, the kind of question that required real honesty rather than practiced eloquence. "Do you miss me?" she asked. "Or do you miss the house?" Richard opened his mouth to answer immediately, the way he might have answered a hostile question in a deposition, with speed and confidence covering for uncertainty. But nothing came. He sat there in silence, and the silence itself became its own answer, more honest than anything he could have said aloud. Naomi watched him search for words that would not come, and in that long pause, she understood something she had perhaps already known for weeks, but had not allowed herself to fully accept until that moment. Whatever Richard was mourning, it was not her, not truly, not the person she actually was beneath 20 years of quiet accommodation. He was mourning the comfort, the stability, the version of his life that had allowed him to believe he was the center of it. She reached into her bag and placed a plain envelope on the table between them, sliding it across the surface with the same steady calm she had carried since the night he first walked out the door. Inside, Richard found the divorce papers Helen had drawn up on Naomi's behalf. The terms laid out in language that was almost startling in its simplicity. There would be no dispute over the lake house because it had never been marital property to begin with. There would be no claim against the investment company, the trust, or the stock portfolio, because none of it had ever legally belonged to their union. Naomi was not asking for anything Richard had earned, and she was not offering him anything beyond what fairness genuinely required. It was, in every sense, the cleanest possible ending to a marriage that had grown anything but clean. Richard read through the pages slowly, and somewhere in the reading, the last of his resistance seemed to leave him entirely. His own attorney had already told him, in no uncertain terms, that pursuing a contested claim against Naomi's assets would likely end in a courtroom loss significant enough to damage both his finances and his professional reputation, given how visible their case had already become within legal circles. He looked up from the papers and met Naomi's eyes, and whatever he had come to that cafe hoping to salvage, he understood now that it was not going to happen, not because Naomi was punishing him, but because there was simply nothing left to salvage that had ever truly been shared between them in the way he had assumed. He signed the papers 3 weeks later, in Helen's office, with none of the drama that had marked the night their marriage first broke apart. Vanessa had already distanced herself entirely by then, unwilling to remain attached to a man whose professional standing had taken a visible hit once word of the failed claim spread quietly through his firm's upper ranks. Colleagues who had once admired Richard's aggressive confidence now regarded him with a more cautious curiosity, wondering privately how a man so skilled in the courtroom had so thoroughly misjudged his own marriage. His path forward would require rebuilding, not from financial ruin, since his own earnings remained substantial, but from something harder to repair, the quiet erosion of a reputation built on the assumption that he was always the smartest person in any room he entered. A year passed, and the lake house that had once been the site of Richard's public unraveling had become something entirely different under Naomi's steady hand. She had spent months reimagining the property, not as a monument to a broken marriage, but as a space built entirely around her own values, the ones she had quietly protected for 20 years, while accommodating someone else's ambitions. Part of the estate had been converted into a small retreat space, welcoming guests who came seeking quiet and rest along the water. Another section had become a gallery of sorts, filled with work from local artists Naomi had begun collecting and supporting, a passion she had never had the freedom to fully pursue during her marriage. Twice a year, she hosted fundraising gatherings on the grounds, bringing together donors and mentors to support women launching their own small businesses, women who reminded her, in one way or another, of the quiet, patient ambition she had carried for most of her adult life. Marcus Reed still managed the property, as loyal and steady as he had been the day he told Richard, without hesitation, that he answered to Naomi Carter alone. Helen Brooks visited often, no longer strictly in her role as attorney, but simply as a friend who had watched Naomi step fully into a life that had always been hers to claim. The two women would sit on the same balcony where Naomi had once stood watching Richard pound helplessly against the gate, sharing quiet evenings that required no explanation and no performance, the kind of comfort that only exists between people who have truly seen each other. One afternoon, nearly a year to the day after that first confrontation at the gate, Richard happened to drive along the lakeside road, the same route he had once traveled with such easy confidence. He slowed as the property came into view, taking in the changes, the new signage near the entrance, the small groups of guests moving easily across the grounds, the unmistakable sense of a place that had found its purpose. Through the trees, he caught a glimpse of Naomi standing near the water, laughing at something one of her guests had said, entirely at ease, in a life that clearly no longer required his presence to feel complete. He did not stop the car. He did not reach for his phone. He simply watched for a moment, taking in the sight of a woman he had once dismissed as nothing without him, now standing fully and visibly in the center of a life she had built almost entirely on her own terms. There was no grand confrontation left to have, no dramatic gesture that could undo what had already been settled a year earlier in a quiet lawyer's office. He drove on, and whatever he felt in that moment, regret, admiration, or simple recognition, remained his alone to carry. Naomi never spoke of that final glimpse, because she never knew it had happened, and it would not have changed anything about the life she had chosen even if she had. She had not built this new chapter as an act of revenge, and she felt no particular satisfaction in imagining Richard's regret from a distance. What she felt instead was something quieter and far more durable, the simple, settled peace of a woman who had spent 2 decades being underestimated and had finally allowed herself the freedom to be exactly who she had always been. She did not need to announce her worth to anyone, and she certainly did not need to prove it to the man who had once told her she was nothing without him. In the evenings, after her guests had gone, and Marcus had finished his final rounds of the grounds, Naomi liked to walk down to the edge of the water alone, the same shoreline she had first purchased more than 2 decades earlier as a young woman with more patience than certainty about what her life would become. She thought, on those walks, about the version of herself who had signed that first deed, quiet and unassuming, with no way of knowing the marriage that would come later or the ending that marriage would eventually reach. She did not think that younger woman would be surprised by where she had ended up. If anything, she suspected that woman had known all along, in some quiet, patient way, that the ground beneath her feet would always hold, no matter what storms arrived to test it. She had learned, over the course of that difficult year, that strength rarely announced itself the way people expected. It did not shout, and it did not need an audience. It simply stood still, calm and unshaken, while everything around it tried and failed to move it. That was the lesson she carried forward into every fundraiser she hosted, every young entrepreneur she mentored, every quiet evening spent on a balcony that had once witnessed the worst night of her marriage and had since become the backdrop for something far better. She did not need Richard to understand what he had lost. She only needed to keep living, fully and without apology, in the life she had always been quietly building for herself. The night Richard told her she was not his wife anymore, he had believed he was taking her future away, certain that whatever came next for her would be smaller, harder, and lesser without him beside her. He never understood, not in that kitchen, not at the locked gate, not even in the quiet cafe where he finally read the truth laid out in plain, undeniable language, that he had not taken anything from her at all. He had simply walked away from the best thing that had ever happened to him and left behind, without ever fully realizing it, the very woman whose quiet strength had built the life he once mistook entirely for his own.